Buenas tardes.
Good evening. Good evening, friends. Firstly, thank you so much for being here at this special event. It's special for all of us. It's an event that the S&D Group have wanted to organize to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile. Isabel, Sergio, friends, as I said, thank you so much for being here. This is such an important event for our political family, because there was a man who made us dream to progress towards pluralist, libertarian social democracy, and that man was Salvador Allende. Isabel, I'm aware that you must be overwhelmed with memories and emotions over the past few days, a difficult mix of emotions which aren't easy to express, and I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here with us today. Friends, it's impossible not to link the man that was Salvador Allende with the message from that 11th of September in 1973 from the presidential palace. Our generation has heard that message time and time again in our homes since we were children. It's not easy to forget those powerful words loaded with hope in the face of the certainty that we would be progressing towards a better society. Today, our world is different. It's a different world to the one that your father knew. But you yourself has said that in some ways it's actually not that different at all. Also, the answer to the great challenges that we're facing today are similar, and we often hear many of the same discourses that fuel the hate and uncertainty in our society. We recently celebrated the summit of the planet in Stockholm, and we talked about the existential threat that we're facing today as we see the results of climate change. The Earth Summit opened a decade of war and social problems that we're hearing. Today we're seeing the consequences of a war, the war of Russia against Ukraine. This is a criminal war against a country that dreamt of freedom and sovereignty. This war doesn't only undermine the essential pillars of peaceful coexistence, but it has also generated an energetic and food crisis, which undermine well-being for the most of us. Like in the time of Salvador Allende, we mustn't stop fighting to protect the lower classes. His name is inseparable for the fight for social justice in Chile that was plagued by poverty and hunger. Today, our ideals haven't changed. We must protect the weakest people from the strongest people and guarantee that we commit to removing the socioeconomic inequalities caused by this war. Salvador Allende fought so that the Chilean people could benefit from their own natural resources. And today, we must be able to guarantee an ecological transition which guarantees energy sovereignty and which allows us to build a fair model of economic growth, where the benefits for the large companies do improve the living conditions for everybody. This is something that we really insist on at the moment. Economic growth is not enough in itself. Economic growth has to make sure that the majority of people live better. The commemoration of this bloody coup is an opportunity for us to reflect. 50 years later should be enough time to look ahead to the future. This hasn't necessarily been the case for Chile, but the EU is currently looking at an historic example of revisionism. Chile has been plagued with negative speeches denying the terrorism in a similar way as the EU. Pinochet was a tyrant who refused political parties and caused more than 3,000 deaths and tens of thousands of political prisoners and exiled people. It took 17 years to break this dictatorship. Chile is at a key point in its history. It's time to overlook differences and to make sure that we unite when we look at what happened, because there is no excuse for state-endorsed terrorism or violence, whatever its origin. Friends, there is still much left to be done. As progressive leaders, we have to look to the future through the prism of the principles of liberty, equality, and social justice. We have to realize that people look at how people react at critical times in their life. Allende is forged in the memory of Chile as a president who resisted and protected his principles, as a democrat who didn't accept to be humiliated. He was a leader who ordered people to leave the presidential palace to save their lives so that they could tell the story. He asked people not to sacrifice themselves in vain. He ended his life to make sure we could never forget his message. He delivered his speech on the 4th of December 1972, and this speech has been a vital life lesson. He said, "I've come from Chile, a small country, but every citizen is free to express themselves as they want to, regardless of their religion or ideology, without racial discrimination." Today, in the face of an extreme right trying to repress the history of Europe and criminalizing humans who risk their lives for a better future, Allende's words remind us that it's still possible to believe in the best of humanity. I want to talk about an event which maybe some of you here today haven't heard of, and remind that in life, words are meaningless if they aren't accompanied by facts. Many Spanish refugees got on the whipping and left. The journey became one of the biggest group of passengers in all of the history of refugees. There was a young man aboard, a man who a few years later founded the Socialist Party of Chile in Valparaiso. He was the health minister of the Chilean government and a doctor as well. The speaker stopped speaking. That man had the mission of coordinating the vaccine administration so that all the hungry Spanish people arriving could be looked after. That man was Salvador Allende. A few days ago, as we shouted in the Moncloa, Allende is alive today and forever. Thank you very much.
Como
Many of you know me, and many of you said before that if you get a bit emotional, you absolutely don't have to apologize. So it's an absolute pleasure for me now to thank you so much for being here, Isabel. For us, for our group, for everybody here today. It really is so important that you're here with us today and that we've got the opportunity to listen to you. I'd like to ask that once we've been through the whole table, there will be time for some questions. Isabel will be able to respond to some of the questions that you have. So I'll now give her the floor, and then we'll continue with the rest of the table. I'd like to start by thanking Irache and thanking each and every one of you here today. Thank you to all of you as well for giving up your time, and so that the S&D group today shows that they're helping us to commemorate these 50 years. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. It's been 50 years since a military coup which should never have happened. It was a crime. A democracy may be polarized. There may be differences between the people, of course, but we cannot and must not justify a coup which led to all of the consequences that we saw, the most serious infringements of human rights which we've seen. There were tortures in an unprecedented level, disappearances, which I believe is one of the most serious crimes, because it doesn't even mean that the family can mourn properly until they've found the remains of their families. People who are exiled, people who are tortured. That's something that we had never seen before in the history of our country. Latin America is known and was known before for having coups d'etat, and that's true. It results in a lot of loss and pain. However, in our case, it was particularly brutal because I believe my father truly believed that it was a country with a lot of democratic stability, and where there was ever more awareness and strength for the people. And the dream that he was sharing with us had been possible. He believed that after 40 years of travelling up and down the country. Remember, he was elected as Senate 4 times. He was a presidential candidate 4 times. He arrived at the presidency. He was a man who knew his country from all 4 corners, and he taught us to dream. He made us believe that it was possible to make deep-seated change in a very unequal country with a great poverty, with an unimaginable rate of child mortality, with malnutrition. And he said that it was possible for us to give this wealth to the whole country, but that we needed a deeper agrarian reform, which had been started under the Christian rule in the previous mandate. But he said that we had to deepen this agrarian reform, and we had to make the land productive, not just for the few. But he went further than that. He suggested nationalising the bank and credit so that we could develop, not just for the elite few in our country, in a very oligarchic society. He said it was possible for men and women to access culture and leisure. And we're very proud of how our culture developed in those years. This is one of the most impressive legacies that he left us, the freedom of artists. There was an enormous amount of books. Books were sold on every corner in Santiago. Thousands and thousands and thousands of books of all kind, historic, classical, and people could buy these books. But he told us something else very important. All of these deep-seated change needed to be done in a pluralist democratic environment. And it wasn't easy. We all know that Salvador Allende lived with the backdrop of the Cold War. We saw electoral processes being disrupted and coups in Latin America. But Salvador Allende never subscribed to this ideology. He said that Chile had democratic institution. There would be power for its organizations, for its political parties. And the Popular Party was aware that more than votes, they need awareness. They wanted people to feel like they were part of this dream.
So what I wanted to say is that this process, which was actually running counter to other things that were happening in the 70s, although of course there were some young and enthusiastic people, they decided that they wanted to have faith in this man who had a full awareness and who was looking towards the future. And he wanted to bring about these changes, whatever it took. He wanted to change the way our society was organized. And we feel very proud when we think about the level of popular participation in politics, how people identified themselves. People were part of this collective dream, and they really got involved in this process of change. So, in that sense, we cannot but recognize how important this leader was. This was the Cold War. There was the direct intervention of the USA. And now we've got more information about this than ever. Peter Kumberg, of course, is someone who's studied the archives dedicated to the secret services of the USA. And he's really understood what happened at that time. Now, this type of direct intervention was very common in Latin America, across the continent, not only in the 70s, but before that. For example, the campaign in 1964. Now, there was this whole campaign to try and prevent Allende from arriving in power. Back then, if there wasn't an absolute majority, then there was a choice between the two most popular candidates through the Congress. And action was taken to try and prevent him from coming into power in the first place. And then there was Schneider, with the constitutionalist, who was saying that you need to respect the Constitution. Now, it was maintained that democratically, of course, a choice needed to be made between the two biggest majorities, but the tradition in Chile was to simply elect the person with the most votes. And then, of course, there was Kissinger and Nixon and all of the interference in the Chilean economy. There was the loans, and, of course, all the events that happened after the nationalization of the copper industry. And this was passed by a unanimous vote in Congress. And the US companies were not provided with compensation that they were demanding because of this issue of excessive profit. So, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not trying to justify everything. Of course, errors can be made, but we essentially did make an enormous amount of progress towards improving people's quality of life. Just in those first years, there was all of this aggression that we faced afterwards. And then, of course, there was the copper that was sold over to Europe, and we had to try and make sure that we could receive the necessary payment for all of that. Now, of course, 50 years have passed. This is an enormous amount of time. 50 years since the military coup that should never have taken place. And I want to tell you very sincerely that this has not been easy. It's not been easy because, as Irachi was saying, and this is something I agree with fully, it seems that in the world we are facing a great deal of collective revisionism. And there are people who've tried to say, yes, it can be painful, and of course there's all these human rights issues, but it can be justified because Chile's doing okay. Well, at the end of the day, people say Pinochet did some good work, and that's what people say. So what I'm trying to say is it has been extremely difficult, and I want to recognize here that President Boric, of course, took that decision that this 50-year anniversary needed to be commemorated, and he made sure that this was a solemn event. And we feel supported by all of this. There have been various different prime ministers and presidents that attended the event, from Portugal, for example. Some people weren't able to attend because of the G20, but various different presidents and prime ministers did attend, including President Lacalle from Uruguay. President Boric invited all of these leaders and former leaders. And what he wanted to do was to sign a charter for democracy. He wanted to state that democracy must never again be broken. There's no justification for any coup at any time. And this means that we are now facing a challenge, and that is to defend democracy. But it's not enough just to defend democracy. Democracy also needs to demonstrate its own worth, and it needs to demonstrate its ability to achieve what it's trying to achieve. I would also like to take the opportunity to say that we will never stop expressing gratitude for this enormous wave of solidarity that's been shown for Chile. Now, if you look back, there was the Spanish Civil War, which also generated a great wave of solidarity. In Mexico and Chile received Spanish exiles at that time. And then if you look at Vietnam, that's another case when a great deal of solidarity was shown on the international scale. And I'd like to thank everyone from all corners of the world. Here we are in Belgium. Belgium and many other countries, Sweden, Italy, France, all of these countries have supported us, the Nordic countries as well. We have witnessed how much solidarity they've shown for us. And I think that we are therefore doing something that my father used to talk about in La Moneda. He was saying we needed to go out and do this work. And of course, because I was there with my sister Beatrice, among other advisors, and I'd like to thank those advisors, the group of friends, the detectives as well, that never stopped protecting the president. And there were over 40 of them. They were captured and tortured and disappeared. They all showed loyalty to my father. And he told them that they should leave La Moneda, the presidential palace at that point, because he didn't want other people to die unnecessarily. But they did not leave. And my sister Beatrice and I found it very difficult. What we wanted to do was to share in this experience and be there for him. And what I saw when I was there was a real leader. A leader who was concerned for the welfare of all these other people around him. There was a looming threat of the attack at that point, and this was a leader who was telling his supporters to leave and protect themselves. He instructed them to leave. He said, you need to tell the world about all of these events that have happened. You need to tell the world what happened to this democratically elected president. I'd also like at this point to make a very personal express my very personal thanks to Tencha Busi Allende, my mother, because she spent so many years calling for this international solidarity. Tencha was the one who did all this work. I'd also like to thank all of those countries that I mentioned before. There were countries including India, Japan, Germany, Italy, Spain, all these different countries that have supported us. But I'd also like to thank all of the work that was done by the embassies, which saved the lives of many Chileans. I'd like to thank all of those people who organised committees to welcome the exiles and gave them opportunities, helped them integrate into society, offered them work. And I'd also like to thank all those people who were in Chile, remained in Chile, and who risked their lives to help people. But they attempted to do whatever they could within the Peace Committee, the Solidarity Committee, and all of these different institutions and people that really carried out this work. And all of this was extremely important. And here we stand 50 years later, and we recognize that leader who showed us it was possible to dream of a new, different life. And everything that he stood for remains valid. We still need changes to improve people's lives. He was a doctor, and therefore child nutrition was extremely important for him. He did a great deal of work to combat malnutrition. And then he was also in Mexico at the Guadalajara University. And at that point, he highlighted the fact that the students themselves were very privileged because poor people were not going to university. And he was telling them that they need to understand the poverty experienced by people in their own country. He tried to raise awareness about social issues. He told those young people what they needed to do. And then this speech that he made has been set down in history. People have read it to learn from it. And it's all of this information is very relevant throughout Latin America. So 50 years later, I think that he was right. Democracy is necessary, but it needs to be accompanied by social justice. Democracy is not enough on its own. We need social justice. We need more than that. We need to go beyond all of this. Truth, justice, reparation, and never again. Based on these principles, we are making gradual progress. And President Boric has set up a plan to make sure that states are held responsible. Often it was the families of victims that were carrying out all this work to try and find out what happened to their disappeared relatives. And now he's saying that the state itself needs to take responsibility. It was a state agenda, therefore we are the ones that need to carry out this investigation and hold the necessary authorities accountable. It's not the families themselves that need to bear this whole burden. They have all of this pain that they have to deal with on a daily basis, so why should they have the responsibility as well? I think also he taught us that we still need this social justice. And he also taught us many other things. It's not possible to justify social development if it comes at the expense of our freedom. He also taught us about ethics and politics. They need to go hand in hand. And I think this, again, is something we need to take into account nowadays. As Irachi mentioned, we face very painful challenges right now in Europe, and in North America, and Latin America, and across other continents. Our democracy is being weakened day by day. This isn't about coup d'etat, but it's gradually being eroded. And we're seeing attacks on institutionality, and parliaments and politicians being undermined. And then it's very easy to see the emergence of populist politicians. We have the far right who are saying, yes, let's just expel illegal immigrants from the country and deport them. This is something that people say with great ease. They're trying to scare people. They say all of this, and people then feel they need to be protected. And this is an extremely important topic in Chile. If you look over at Ecuador as well, crimes have been committed there too. Now, of course, we're also facing issues relating to organized crime, climate change, and of course, Chile is a very vulnerable country in that sense. What I'm trying to say is that we need to work together to tackle these challenges. And sometimes I feel that our progressive democratic left wing and social democratic approach is something that we need to hold high. And I think that we need to work together, because sometimes we're faced with people that have a great deal of resources. And sometimes we are being left behind. So at this point, I'd like to really call for solidarity and collective action. We need to stand together and unite to tackle all of these issues, not only for ourselves, but for future generations.
Morar.
So commemorating this 50th anniversary is not just a matter of nostalgia, although of course that is true as well, but it's fundamental. And that's why President Boric said that democracy is memory and future. We're not just remembering, we have to remember that pain, that loss, those violations of human rights, because we understand that today more than ever there are challenges, global challenges, which call for us to act. We have to be more efficient, because young people are crying out for this. We have to find a way to strengthen and deepen our democracy. I firmly believe that Salvador Allende had this vision of the future. He opened many spaces on the international space. He forged relations that didn't exist before with China, with Vietnam, with countries that just we didn't have those links with before. He showed us that it was possible in Latin America to strengthen our links in such a bipolar world as was the world in which he lived. And again, I exist. The negationism hurts. It hurts to see that we're going backwards instead of making progress. It hurts to see the extreme right. When we look at the political parties, they couldn't sign this charter which said always democracy. Regardless, 4 ex-presidents did sign it, and we're proud that they could do that. We've got 3 that were part of the progressive world, but also Piñera. And what that means is that between those presidents, they were capable together of looking ahead. It hasn't been easy. However, on the other hand, I firmly believe that we have felt a lot of support this September. We've been waiting all year. We've been talking about conversations, books, films, documentaries. There have been so many activities and we've received so much support. Despite the criticism, we've been doing this because it's a solemn event and it's the right thing to do. We have a poet, much loved, Mario Benedé, in Uruguay. And they said something which I think was really beautiful and I'd like to share with you briefly. I feel that it's more relevant than ever. We've been working for changes and for social justice So I'd like to discuss this poet Mario Benedetti. It shows loyalty to the people. And Mario Benedetti said, to beat the man of peace, they had to overcome hate. Moreover, planes and tanks. To kill the man of peace, they had to work for it. To kill the man of the people, they had to do away with the people. Thank you very much.
Preciosas.
What precious words from Benedetti, which perfectly encapsulate not just reality, but the emotion that we're feeling right now. We'll now continue with the rest of the speeches. I'd like to give the floor first to my colleague, Ms. Rodriguez Pinheiro, the President of the European Parliament delegation to Chile, who has also worked hard to make sure that we could hold this event today. Immaculada, you have the floor. Wow, that was amazing. That was very profound. Thank you so much, Irache, for organising the event, and thank you so much, Isabel, for being here. We know how much effort you've made. Welcome to all of you here with us today. It shows that you really believe in what Salvador Allende represented, the values of socialism. It's just so difficult to speak after you, Isabel, to follow you up. It's not difficult, actually, it's impossible. But I'd like to thank you so much. Your work, your sincerity, your defense of human rights to keep your father's legacy alive. Without doubt, this is also Chile's legacy. And it's the legacy of socialists for the future generations. It's such a proud thing to believe in socialism. I think we've seen the global impact of the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the brutal coup d'etat led by Pinochet. I truly believe, Isabel, that your effort has borne fruit. I'd like to say that more than my colleague, when we're organising summits between Chile and the EU, Isabel is a beloved friend. We've been working together for years to strengthen political and economic, social relations between the EU and Chile. Nevertheless, and I think this is a good sign, I'm still so excited. That's one of the things that separates us from animals, to get truly excited. I'm moved by the dignity and the empathy with which you talk about everything that happened. When it happened, at the time, afterwards, during the coup, after the coup, and how you explain things. We are infinitely grateful to you for doing so. You are still dedicating your life to defending democracy and reconciliation. You have fostered unity, defending unity and coexistence in Chile, despite the fact that there are still people there trying to justify the unjustifiable and the repression which followed on both sides of the Atlantic, which was brutal. Over the past week in Strasbourg, we held a commemorative event to mark the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile. And there was a Euro diplomat. Of course, we have them here as well, who were from the extreme right. Those who do try to defend the indefensible. We are sharing, supporting, bearing, and living the same challenges, the same fears. We're in a world beset by threats. I believe that in this geopolitical context, it is worth referencing you. I quote, "The problems of democracy cannot provoke violence. The fall of institutions and the blocking the ignorance of people who believe differently." Close quote. This should guide our work. We are politicians who represent citizens. They need us to resolve their problems. Today, we remember that we must defend democracy every day, that it is worth fighting for freedom and equality, and that fight falls to all of us. Democracy is under threat. Therefore, we have to work together. We must defend it, protect it, and preserve it. As with Chile, the EU, and Spain, we see the emergence of the extreme right, trying to rewrite history and denying the coup against Allende. Salvador Allende always knew which side he had to be on. You've described that very well, but I think it's important to remember that he was one of the 4 doctors within the 500 militaries who created the Socialist Party in Chile. What a proud thing. Despite the permanent boycott and the intervention from the US, which you have explained, he still fought to show his commitment to poor people and the working class. He tried to make sure that the benefits of the natural resources were shared by the people. He developed all kinds of social measures. He tried to make sure there was universal healthcare and to educate the entire population. And that's not to mention the significant role that he played in international relations, as you mentioned, as one of the great leaders of one of the non-aligned group. He also had a feminist approach. In his famous speech in Radio Magallanes, the first group that he mentioned when saying goodbye were the women. He thanked women for their work, for their support. And I think that that's another legacy, feminism and equality, which we have to give him credit for. Despite the dark times during Pinochet, Chile is still an example of democracy. It's an example of solid democracy for the world, with problems, as with every country, but still proud. I'm going to give you some data. According to the Global Democratic Health Index from The Economist, which talks about democracy in the countries, they have data up until 2020. They said that in the world there are only 24 fully fledged democracies, which represent only 8% of the global population. And Chile is in that number. Pinochet's dictatorship, as well as autocracies, were and are bad for citizens. And we have to make that really clear and support it. Dictatorships and autocracies, as well as putting an end to freedoms, actually increase inequality and damage the economy. I'll give you some more data. At the start of the dictatorship, the income per head in Chile was 28% that of in the US. After the dictatorship, this percentage had been reduced to 25%, 3 percentage points. After 8 years of democracy, we can see the reverse effect. The income per head in Chile had increased by 9 points to 34% of that of the US, and that has doubled in nearly 20 years. Similarly, the dictatorship of Pinochet achieved something quite difficult. They made it that the minimum salary was lower in 1989 than it had been in 1974, broadening the inequality, the wealth gap. That's why it's difficult to understand why such a high number of people in Chile don't seem to realize how harmful the dictatorship was. We have to do something. We have to work for unity, for democracy, and to improve people's lives, making policies which help them. I think what better tribute could we pay to Salvador Allende than to continue defending his ideals? They are the same as ours, the fight for democracy, social justice, and for respect between countries. I'd like to finish with some words.
Mientras los aviones.
He's from Allende, and he said that when the planes were bombing La Moneda, he said, they might attack us, but they know that we're here. And this country, there are people who know how to fulfill their duties. We want them to know we're here. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Inma.
Thank you. Now I have the great pleasure to introduce Sergio Rojas Fernandez. I'd also like to thank you, Sergio, for having come to share this moment with us today. A trade unionist, political prisoner, socialist. Sergio, you set a great example for many of us, men and women, on the progressive left. And we see you as someone who we can learn from. Thank you very much for being here, Sergio. Over to you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Friends, each one of you, I'd like to greet every one of you. Now, at this point, I'm just going to perhaps step outside the standard context of this event. I'm going to talk about the 3 years of popular unity. I won't tell you about every detail, but I would just like to tell you about the main points that have really stayed with me.
Que me da el gusto de trasladarla a...
For various years, I worked in an institution training leaders with a new approach. And so I'd like to say what I've taken inspiration from. And I think many great ideas came from the time of Salvador Allende. In 1952, on a Saturday morning, my dad said to me, Sergio, tomorrow we need to dress up because we're going to see the future president of Chile, and he's going to talk to us in a mountain village near Santiago. this was the first time that Allende was standing as a candidate. And then, so there in that tiny village, Allende spoke to around 200 people who were gathered together in the square. This was, of course, after they'd been to Mass. And he explained his manifesto in very clear, direct language. He explained the need to wage a long struggle against the forces of the right. And he spoke about the effect of the Catholic Church. And in his clear speech, he talked directly to the peasants. And I'll try and repeat what he said. He said, "Look at your feet. Every one of you is wearing ojotas. These are rubber shoes, which are quite a basic type of footwear in Chile. So you are wearing those shoes, and you can see that your bosses are wearing leather shoes and they ride horses. Then my region is a mining region, and he spoke to all of the people there and the peasants there. He said, as difficult as it might be to arrive at the government that we are trying to put together, we must have faith." Now, there were many of these rallies that were held, and this was a region where there were many mines, and eventually many of the mines were closed. There were also a place where railways were a big industry linking the villages to the towns. When I heard Allende speaking, I really understood where I fit in, what my role was. Excuse me.
¿Dónde está mi lugar en
I knew where I fit into this struggle. Many years later, in 1970, I had the opportunity to shake the hand of this great politician. In 1970, for the third time, he was standing as a presidential candidate. At that time, I was the secretary for the Socialist Party in the trade union that we'd created in the textile factory where I worked. At that point, Allende turned up and wanted to speak to the workers. The boss of the company, a Syrian, denied him entry. And we heard that Allende wanted to speak to the workers, so we went directly to speak to the boss, and we reminded him that he had essentially forced us, around 600 people, to listen to the speech of the Conservative Party, Mr. Palma, who was from a rich family. He practically forced us to listen to that speech. In any case, he didn't want to listen to our arguments, and he forced us out of his office. So then we did what one has to do in those cases. We gave instructions to our comrades to make sure that we stopped production in the factory. Minutes later, the whole company was completely paralyzed, and the machines lay silent. There were over 500 men and women who worked in that factory, and nobody dared to touch any piece of machinery. All of the workshops lay completely silent. All of the different types of machines, the packaging machines, the sewing machines, all of them, which had come from Europe, of course, were completely silent. And the inspection service that was very a very strong presence in all Chilean companies, ran around trying to solve the issue, and they had no luck. We, the trade unionists, were delighted to see when the boss ran out to his car with his chauffeur, and then he said, "Do whatever you like." We opened the doors of the factory and we welcomed the whole delegation led by Allende. It was exceptional. We even took him around the whole building and we brought him to speak. And he said many things that remained with us even years later. And he explained that what we were doing was unique in Chile. He also explained that what we were doing was a great challenge, and the working classes in Chile faced such a great struggle. And he encouraged the workers, men and women, to work in a spirit of greater awareness. And he said that more would need to be done to make progress for the workers themselves and not to fill the pockets of their bosses. This was a new experience. Later in 1970, Allende was elected as president. Various different textile companies were the first ones to form what was called the social property area. This was quite a unique occasion. And then from that moment on, changes were brought about across the whole industrial sector in the country. And at that point, I stood as a candidate for the workers' councils. And this was a really new era in the world of work, as Allende had demonstrated by visiting us. Now, as he'd said, the struggle that we were waging was not just against the capitalist system or our bosses. It was more than that. The struggle was about who was in charge of the companies. Various different contradictions of the capitalist system were demonstrated quite clearly. Day by day, we saw the evidence of the class struggle. And I can still see evidence of this now. There were many methods that were used as part of this direct conflict between the different classes across the world and in Chile. Many people deny the class struggle. They deny the existence of this struggle and the fact they deny that people are being exploited. We, the workers, were not simply fighting for the Popular Unity's manifesto. We were faced with an extensive conflict and confrontation. Now, we were working at a very small company. It only had around 600 workers. And in that country, we didn't all have the same level of awareness of what was going on. We had to combat the ignorance of many of the other workers. Let me just give you an example. And this is also an example of a contradiction. On the day when the assembly decided that the company needed to be led by the workers itself, which was a decision issued by the Labour Ministry in 1970, when Allende arrived in power. At that point, a group of women went to the machines downstairs and they threw them to the ground. This was a protest. And this was a valid response of these women. They knew that they, at that point, would be able to enter the company and leave the company as they wished. And they knew that they would be able to avoid all the negative impact of the situation prior to that. They were trying to demonstrate how they felt. Now, there was a contradiction that came a few months later. Those same women asked the new members of the management, us, we were workers as well, they asked us to put these machines back in place because they needed to be paid for their overtime hours. Now, these were the clocking in and clocking out machines I'm talking about here. Now, I think we'd have to have a look at the situation from the point of view of the workers themselves. It's worth really looking into this. These were unique moments for Chile. And I think we have a great deal to learn.
As time keeps going, the control of the businesses and the workers changed, and there was a new attitude to work, a new attitude to production control. Production committees were established, seeking to increase productivity. We integrated the technical employees of each business into these committees to show that they too were part of this same process. To do that, we needed to train female and male technical workers. So there was communication between us and the university. Therefore, we learnt and the workers learnt that the products weren't being produced just for the boss. They knew that the fruits of their labour wouldn't just end up in banks in the US. They learnt that when they were working for a system which they themselves controlled, it was a completely different ballgame. On the night of the 4th of September, our boss and his family were on their way to Miami. They were escaping from communism as they saw it. But moreover, they were also escaping for the corruption that they'd been guilty of. We had to decide what to do. The new government still hadn't been inaugurated. That didn't happen until November, so we had to call a General Assembly for workers. The trade union had legal representation before the Ministry of Work. That's how that was the situation when Salvador Allende arrived in government. For us, workers throughout the country, I was at the head of 350 textile workers in Miami. When I came back to my country for the first time, 18 years later, I asked what would happen to these 350,000 workers. This was one of the first rules that Pinochet's government introduced, to destroy the syndicates and to separate us. That was the situation that we found ourselves in. You already know the rest of the story, and probably better than I do. Opposition to the government and lies about what the workers had been doing. They said that it was a communist dictatorship. For them, it worked that there was money arriving from Washington. It was a ploy to sabotage production. As we've heard about Nixon and Kissinger's involvement, trying to make the economy fall. I'd like to take this opportunity to pay sincere tribute Speaker, stop speaking. Comrades, in my business they killed 3 leaders. I remember them fondly, and I want to pay them a sincere tribute. This is the result of the armed stretch of capitalism. I firmly believe in Chile and its destiny. Better sooner than later, man will be free. And at 15:30 tomorrow, with our dear colleague Isabel, will welcome us, and we'll meet with her again. We've already mentioned one great poet from Latin America, among the many that we have. I'd like to finish by saying that down near the roots, where there is memory, there are people living, people who are achieving everything that is possible. The world should know that the South is here. Thank you.
Gracias. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Sergio, por...
Thank you so much, Sergio, for what you've said, for your emotions, for sharing, and for being here today, joining us on the path. And now I'm going to give the floor to Maria Manuel Tierra Marquez, who is our coordinator for Eurolat and the S&D group. She's progressive, committed, and a woman who works for everything that we're here talking about today, and the defence of democracy and social justice. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Irache. Thank you, Isabel, Hima, Javi, friends, colleagues, diplomats. Thank you for all of you for being here today. I remember the 11th of December of 1973, when the hope of social democracy washed away with the rain that fell in Santiago, when they removed the elect president. I was in Portugal, and we cried for a country that we didn't know, for a president whom we'd never seen. over the next few months, we continued to cry as we heard about the deaths of people in the stadium or those who were disappeared to who knows where. And then we sang the songs that we heard in so many European cities, people walking with their instruments, and we adopted those. We heard "The people will never be beaten." We cried the end of a vibrant democracy. Chile was one of the most stable and consistent democracies of all Latin America. Chile never had a strongman approach, as did in neighbouring countries. They were more similar to European dictatorships. The United States completely ignored this difference. They didn't wait for new elections, and they applied the typical recipe for intervention. They looked for their own economic interests, despite the risk of, in the face of a risk from a Latin America country. We've heard the recording in the Museum of Memory. We heard the conversation between Nixon and Kissinger shortly after the coup, talking about how it was necessary to stop any exit that the president could have right from the beginning. It's still shocking to see the wall with all the photos of those people who were killed and disappeared, and to hear the stories of torture. These stories must be remembered today, precisely when some forces are gaining power in South America and should be governing in good conditions. 50 years on from the criminal and unnecessary coup, as Isabel said, fortunately, it's not raining in Santiago anymore. However, the traces of this barbarous act are still felt. Many of the crimes are still going without punishment, and there is a pact of silence which means that we can't find the remains of hundreds of detained people. It is still very important to pay tribute to President Allende, a Democrat and a socialist who was truly committed, and also a thought for all those victims of the tyrannical reign of Pinochet. We mustn't forget those people who fought and died for the ideals of equality, liberty, dignity, solidarity, and justice. We promised Allende that, as well as promising all of our Chilean brothers and sisters listening to us here today. His last words and his sacrifice were not in vain. His legacy remains alive. Long live Chile. Long live the people. Remember his last words. Thank you.
Preciosas palabras.
Those were very precious words from Maria Manuel. This is an excellent day, isn't it? We're really getting emotional, and I think that's a good thing. It says a lot about us, ourselves, and of course, I'm sure we're going to get very emotional with our next speaker, our friend Javi Lopez, chair of Eurolat. He's also a very dedicated socialist and is working towards this progressive agenda of the South, the global South. And of course, that's something that Europe needs to support. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Irache. It's a real honor for me to be here today with Isabel Allende, Senator, here on this panel to talk about this anniversary. And of course, we celebrate this every 11th of September. Throughout the whole of September, in fact, we always pay tribute. And this September is very special indeed. I just want to make sure that it's clear to you what we do. So what do we do on the 11th of September? Well, we remind people of what a leader Allende was and of what he did in the government. We also talk about the social progress that he made against the oligarchs and all the improvements that he made in the field of food and human rights and labor. And a great deal of progress was made to include people that had been thereto excluded. And we do recognize all of his work. The second thing that we do on the 11th of September is that we refuse to forget. We do not forget, because not forgetting is the only way that we can avoid repeating the past. We do not want to see a repeat of an illegal, criminal military coup. We do not forget the victims of this terrible dictatorship in the country, with thousands of people who were tortured, disappeared, who had to go into exile. We do not forget what happened at the end of that full democracy. As has been said in a famous song, the red cockerel is always brave, and the black cockerel is one who betrays. Thirdly, we mark the death of Salvador Allende, and we always remember his final words. Why is that? Because, for example, the words of Magallanes had a great deal of impact on politics on many different generations and decades of progressive politicians. And so the same happens here. These words are echoing throughout the decades, and we must continue to listen to those words and remember them. And I always remember an interview which I heard when I was young, Alberto Golano, the Chilean writer who was also in exile in Barcelona in this case. He was a great writer, unfortunately, who died a while ago. And I remember hearing his words. I think it would have taken a whole lifetime to understand his words in full. He was a young activist in Chile who supported the cause of the popular government. And he explained that when he had heard the words of Magallanes, he had felt betrayed. He said, I was a young person who was ready to take up arms and fight because of this leader, this figure of Allende. And he felt very disappointed in a way. Of course, not everyone can fight for the cause that they support, but he was saying that a great many people were ready to sacrifice themselves for the government of Allende and to defend Allende, and he was almost disappointed he wasn't able to do that. So he said that he actually left the country in floods of tears because he wanted to stay. And he said, it took me a whole lifetime to really understand what his speech meant. And what it meant was that Salvador Allende was telling us that you will have an opportunity to do all of this. We will suffer, but it's better that I sacrifice myself than everyone sacrificing themselves. And he explained that it had taken him a lifetime to really understand Allende's words and what they meant, to understand how, in fact, Allende's speech had saved him and a whole generation, because they could have ended up in a civil conflict, a civil war in the country. So in fact, he'd been saved. So that's the impact of that speech, of Allende's last words, that we continue to listen to. And the fourth thing that we do every 11th of September is that we come together to make sure that we reinforce our principles, and we decide that we're going to continue fighting for social justice. And we will continue to walk down the boulevards of freedom. And we will continue with what we are doing, of course, combating these forces that are trying to bring us down. And we will continue to fight for equality, social justice, truth and democracy. And we remember every time that the red cockerel is always brave. El gallo rojo siempre es valiente.
Bueno, pues estas grandes...
These have been excellent speeches to listen to, and unfortunately we have run over. But before we leave, I would like to thank the interpreters, the workers who've been working for us here today. This is not a normal time of day to work at the Parliament, so I'd really like to thank the interpreters from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for having stayed with us to the very end. Thank you very much to everyone for being here. Thank you for coming to share this emotional moment with us. And this really gives meaning to everything that we do day by day. Thank you very much.